Bert Stedman, Senator representing District R, which is the Island District in Southeast. Everything south of Senator Egan's district. What we have, before I start, I have a cough that comes and goes a little bit, as you know, because we've worked around each other for quite some time here this winter, so I've got a little bit of water and I might stop and grab a lozenge or something if need be. But, what I'd like to do, Mr. Chairman, is kind of set the stage a little bit for this bill. And what we're going to talk about here is the permanent fund management. And what this doesn't address, and intentionally doesn't address, and we'll go into more detail, and that's the state's fiscal system. So this is not a fiscal system solution bill, although it is a major portion of a fiscal solution. And in taking a look at the permanent fund and the creation of it, if I back up for about, pretty close to 30 years, in Sitka, I had a little investment business going and started meeting with the city fathers and mothers about changing their permanent fund to a percent of market value, which we did over a period of about 4 years. Not too dissimilar than what's going on here. It takes quite some time to actually talk about it and get people comfortable with it and evolve it, because it's a big decision. But we, in the community there, changed the operation of the city permanent fund from an all bond portfolio to a balanced portfolio of stocks and bonds, basically 60-40, 60% equities or stocks that give you more growth, and 40% bonds, which gives you more income and stability. With the look back, like we've talked about in this building, that we're all familiar with, to look back 5 years for smoothing to stabilize the cash flows. So the permanent fund, Mr. Chairman, is really a composition of two major accounts: the constitutional budget reserve, the principal, protected principle of the Constitution, and then the earnings reserve that is not constitutionally protected. But from the state's perspective, the constitutional budget reserve is a rainy day account along with the statutory budget reserve. And it's been raining, as we all know, financially speaking, for several years now. And those are pretty much diminished relative to their historic peaks. And we're in a position now where we want to look at seriously restructuring the permanent fund. But the permanent fund is something that's set in place for future generations, and we're supposed to save and grow the assets. So when we take a look at how we're going to do this, we've got to look a little bit back in history. The permanent fund for Alaska was created in '76 by a vote of the people, and it's really a storage mechanism for the wealth generated off of our finite, as we know, oil and gas and other resources. Some of the comments I'm going to make is towards the general public, that all of us in this room here, get into this in minute detail quite a bit, and I'll get into a little bit more detail here a little while. But this, for most of our adult lives, when I look at around the room, I graduated from high school in 1974. So this pretty much has been in place my entire adult life and has grown, and we've worked very hard to do that as a state over time. But we have let it grow, and we've added in the legislature billions of extra dollars to the constitutionally protected portion. And on this chart, we see we've got the blue portion, which is the principal or the constitutionally protected, and the kind of a gold colored, that's the earnings reserve, which is, for those watching at home, that's your trading profits, your net gains and losses, your dividends, your interest income, that type of stuff. So one thing I'd like the public and my colleagues to take note of is the gold little bar, or yellow, whatever, the earnings reserve changes a lot. And we all know that economics change, the economic conditions of the country change from year to year, month to month, or decade to decade. And we have expansions and we have contractions. And when we have a contraction, now it normally goes worldwide, we have substantial losses in our equity investments, our stock markets, our value of our corporations go down. And this is reflected in the basic disappearance of the yellow bars. So when you take a look at 1996, 1998 area, there's virtually no yellow bar there at all. Somewhere around '03, and if I can just magnify that a little bit and look at kind of the permanent fund since 2000, and we can go clear back and to the beginning of the permanent fund, and frankly, in financial markets, we can go back with fairly good data to around 1928. But if you take a look at the lighter blue that sits on top of the darker bars, the darker bars is constitutionally protected, and for those at home, that's the portion that the legislature cannot access without a vote of the people. But the blue bar, the trading profits and the dividends, we can appropriate that, and we do every year. That's where we pay out the dividends. That's where we do inflation proofing. That's where we're talking about getting some funds this very year for the next fiscal year to pay our bills. But I'd like you to take a note of 2003. And in 2003, those are in billions. So we had 24 billion in principal and, 100 million in earnings reserve. The next year, a little less than 858, a little less than $1 billion in earnings reserve. If we jump up to 2009, we see the earnings reserves down to 420 million. Next year, it's 1.2 billion. So when we take a look at relying on the permanent fund and pulling money out of it, we all recognize we can only pull funds out of the lighter colored bar on top. Well, some years there isn't any. And I'd like to also kind of highlight that we haven't, in the legislature, appropriated monies out of the earnings reserve other than dividends. Inflation proofing just goes into the other account. We've taken a little bit every year off for internal management of the permanent fund. It kind of runs itself, but for all significant analysis, it's basically, we haven't touched it until this year. So we are having quite a discussion going on how to deal with this. And the main focus of the presentation today, Mr. Chairman, is that we can look at the permanent fund from several different angles. We can look at it here from the state or from the legislative perspective as a milk cow for revenue. How much can we get out of it and not have it collapse? And have that type of discussion and that type of an analysis, and we can come up with some numbers, and we can start pulling money out. And maybe we get the number right, maybe we don't. And it could be driven by our budgetary needs in the operating and capital budget. Mainly the operating, which for those watching at home is our basic services. Health and welfare, state patrol, prisons, fish and game, DOT, all that type of stuff. Most of which goes, probably a good half of it goes directly pretty much to the communities and the people around the state. Or we can take another approach, which I think we should be doing, and that is isolating the needs of the state, basically set them off the table and look at the permanent fund and say what and how, or I should say how should this permanent fund be structured and managed for its long-term viability for future generations. We have been very fortunate, our generation, that we've had a huge oil wealth come in over our working life. And we're in a little dip now, but it looks like, in several years, we might have another big surge for quite some time. We don't really know till we get there. But But if we were to look at the permanent fund outside of our budgetary needs and ask ourselves, how should we structure it? If we didn't need the money, we didn't care, how should we structure it to make it run? Clearly, from this slide, if we rely on the structure we have today and we rely on draws from the earnings reserve, there'll be times like in 2009 when there's virtually no earnings reserve, or 2003. It's just a matter of time. It's not if, it's when. So we need to take a serious look at how we're structured. And as long as there's the two components, the constitutionally protected, the darker side of the lower part of the bars, or the earnings reserve where we can appropriate out of on the upper side, I think we're in peril of overdrawing it with all good intentions, because we cannot control the financial markets. It's worldwide driven, and sometimes, like in '08, the Federal Reserve has to step in with massive stimulus to keep the economy from imploding. So if we take a look at the permanent fund and follow and not get away from the guiding principles, it's a savings account, and it should be, we should conserve it for future generations. There's no doubt about it. Our forefathers set up this structure, and it's held up, frankly, worldwide as a model. And without going through, the effects of purchasing power, the thief of the night of inflation, we all kind of understand that. We want to come up with something that's going to protect this. So what this proposal does, and there's a couple of really critical parts, and some of them are less critical, and I'll point out some of the ones I feel are less critical. But clearly, one of the most critical parts is we need to put the earnings reserve into the corpus, into the constitutionally protected part. So the entire balance, all of it, is constitutionally protected. That means we cannot draw any money out unless we set up that mechanism also when we constitutionally protect it. We should not have ad hoc draws. When I say we, I'm talking about the current generation today and management of the state, the adults today. I don't feel should have ad hoc draws that are going to significantly or even minorly impact the future balance of the account. The monies or the value of the permanent fund is possibly to use a little bit today, but it's really for future generations. Our grandkids, our great-grandkids that aren't even born yet. Future generations, when we have an oil field that's 100 years old, and not much future in front of it, that we have built up a massive amount of wealth for future Alaskans. And if we allow the current needs, and when I talk about current, I'm talking about, today and next year and year after that, in the near distant future, that if we let our spending desires and our budgetary desires drive the structure of the permanent fund, we could easily make a mistake that hurts our long-term objectives and goals of protecting it for the future of the kids, our future Alaskans. We take a look at what this asks to do is we, number one, combine the earnings reserve with the constitutionally protected principle, so the whole thing is constitutionally protected. Then we put a draw limit on it, and that is how much can we take out in percentage a year. And it doesn't matter if you have a $10 billion portfolio, $60 billion portfolio, or a $20 million portfolio, or for that matter, a $200,000 portfolio. This structure is very similar in all of them. What drives the amount of payout is your asset mix and your rate of return. So your asset mix is going to dictate your potential rate of return, and then your real rate less inflation. So if we put in a structure that doesn't alter the current management structure of the permanent fund. In other words, they don't have to restructure their asset class, move from real estate to stocks or stocks to bonds or what have you. That they basically are left intact just to do their job, manage the fund, knowing at the end of every year they're going to send some funds over to Department of Revenue, and that is going to be set as a percentage number. Here we have 4.5%, and the reason 4.5% is selected is it is below their targeted rate of return, and in front of you can see some of the returns. I would caution you not to get too enamored over a 1-year return. A 3-year return is pretty short also, 5-year. And then if you take a look at inception, gives you multiple year history. But above this 4.5%, you need to have inflation cover. And historic inflation is 2.5%, and now they're using numbers less than that. But if we go back into the 30s, late 20s, it's about 2.5%. So you need a return north of the inflation target and your amount you're going to pull out. You can run that number up till there's no margin left. 4.5% gives you a little bit of room for sloppy markets. There'll be times when the Federal Reserve just gets it wrong, or there'll be an international incident, could be major wars. The policymakers could just flat blow it. And it's all happened in the past. So I would suggest that we don't run it extremely tight, that we leave ourselves a little bit of room. So the 4.5% payout, and then if you take 4.5% off of your market value, so at the end of every year, say it's June 30th, because we work on fiscal years, you basically take 4.5% of the market value. Count up all your money, count up your value of real estate, count up your stocks, count up your bonds, count up your bank accounts, and you just take 4.5% of it. We could do that. What ends up happening if you just use the end of the year balance, you get too much volatility for planning from a budgetary perspective. So if we go back and say, what do we want to smooth this out, we can go back and say we want to take the average of the last 2 years or 3 years. Say we say 3 years. That's easy to do. You just go back 3 years and add it up, divide by 3, and take 4.5% of it. You still have a little bit too much volatility for most budget people to be real comfortable with. So a number that you find used a lot is 5 years. And we've had that talked in the building a lot in a lot of different proposals. 5 years. 5 years is a good number. We actually are now in the building, and along with this proposal, say we go back actually 6 years and use the earliest 5 years because of the timing of the calculations to make sure we know how much money we're actually putting in a pile and counting up to the 4.5%. So that's why there's a 5-year average. You use the average rates of return targeted by your asset allocation, and then you add in your inflation, and you basically have your structure. So some of the most important points when we restructure this permanent fund, well, first you got to get on the road you want to be on. Do you want to be on the road that you're going to just look at it as a milk cow and strain it, which is one road, or you can go down the other road and say, I don't care what initially what the physical position of the state is. I'm not going to let it drive the management and structure of the permanent fund. I want the best structure for the permanent fund, and then I'll come over here and work on this other problem. So we've got a couple things we need to do. We have, and these are rounded numbers, and I know the permanent fund changes value every day, but a few days ago it was about $65 billion. So 4.5% draw, this is how it would work. We got to pay dividends to the people. Some say we don't have to pay any dividends. Some would argue that, the state shouldn't have any of the money, and it all should go to dividends. But historically, the structure of the permanent fund is basically 50% of the available funds go to the dividend, and 50% we have retained to let the permanent fund grow. And we hear that a lot, the 50%. And we've talked about other proposals in the building where the split for the dividend is a different number. This proposed split is 2% for dividends. It would be 2% of the 4.5%. And there's nothing magical about it, 2%. It's an easy number, an easy split for the public to take a look at and see where the money's going. And the committee might, through its process, decide that they want 1.5% or 2.5% or whatever. And that's the process that we need to go through. But if we took 2% off for dividends, that leaves us 2.5%. What we want is the flexibility then to leave the 2.5% in the permanent fund if we don't need it. And although the last several years, there hasn't been any discussion of that, you go back several years before that, we didn't talk about pulling money out from the permanent fund. All of the money stayed in the permanent fund. We've had lots of funds that have been reinvested, additional, above what was required for inflation proofing. So I would suggest that you dismiss the ability that this structure has to only pay out a dividend and leave the rest of it in for future generations. Or if there was a time when the state didn't need the funds and we had high oil prices like we had a few years ago, and we had a shock to the heating system or cost of fuel, so we paid out an extra dividend, we could add more to that dividend if we wanted. Or the third option would be like the times we are today, and probably for the next several years, is where we, the state, would need that 2.5% to come into the state treasury to pay for the basic services, education, pioneers' homes, all that stuff. So it would have flexibility. Since '82, we've distributed about $22 billion to Alaskans. Some people would say the dividend, would have been nice to leave all of the dividend money in the permanent fund, and we'd have over $100 billion or some big fat number. That's one way of looking at it. But the state of Alaska is the only state in the union where the citizens own the subsurface. So we are structured different. In Texas and North Dakota, all that money goes to the private landowner. And then we have movies like Dallas, TV shows like Dallas, because they're making a pile of money. Okay? So we want to share and continue to share the wealth that all the citizens own. If we take a look at the dollars, which is probably what I know a lot of us would like to talk about. If we use the 4.5% draw, and again, just to remind everybody at home that's watching, anything other than 4.5%, it would take a vote of the people to get. If we had an earthquake, if we had spendthrifts in the legislature, they'd have to go to the people. So in 2020, and these are fairly close estimates, the draw would be $2.5 billion, the 4.5. Permanent fund most likely would end with a value of about $67 billion end of that year, but that would leave $1,116,900,000 for dividends, or about an $1,800 dividend with a 2%. That would leave us rounded off 1.1,396,100,000 for the general fund. And markets are not linear. These projections are linear. If everything was a flat line or a slope line, but smooth. The next year you'd have a $1,900 dividend, then almost a $2,000, then a $2,100 dividend. Some people would look at that and say, that's a ghastly big dividend. Why should we give that to the people? If we didn't have the financial crunch we're in today, my personal opinion, we'd be paying out the $2,800 dividend, and we'd be having the governor with a picture with a big check in the paper, like we did before with the previous governors. You know, all the governors wanted to be with the permanent fund head with the big check. So we have different economic times now. So the dividend should be based on the value of the portfolio, and then they get 2% of the market value over 5 years. If the economy expands, the dividend goes up. The economy shrinks, dividend goes down. If we get 1002 opened up, we have more production on oil in our legacy fields. We get Smith Bay going. All these things are going to have huge impacts on the value of the permanent fund, and the values will grow quicker when those assets come online. And also gas. You know, we start doing gas sales, it'll affect us. So this takes the politics out of the dividend. It's very mechanical. Every year, 4.5% comes out, gets split between first cut at it's at 2% for the dividends, and then the remaining balance, and for the next foreseeable future, it would be the state of Alaska. There's no doubt about it. But I think we can work our way out of needing reliance this heavily on the permanent fund as we go forward. And that, I guess, Mr. Chairman, is kind of the gist of it. And let me just recap a little bit, because it's a different conversation that's been in the press for months. You know, this is driven off of how to manage the permanent fund without being unduly influenced over our own financial position, good or bad, the state of Alaska. And how do we set it up to split the earnings and benefit directly with the people, and have the ability of the state treasury and or leave the monies in the fund to grow. And then we can look at this projection here, and we can see roughly 1.4 billion this next year into our budget. And we all know, sitting here, we've all been up to our neck in budget mess the last several years. We know we're going to need more than that. So what we did 30 years ago in Sitka is we had a spending rate of 6%. Financial markets were a lot different then. They had a lot higher dividend yields, and the administrator at the time, he needed cash flow because we lost our pulp mill. We on the investment committee wanted a lower payout because we wanted the future value for the community, and we settled in on a 6% payout, and that's run for years, and that has been ratcheting back now 0.25% a year. We had political difficulties in ratcheting it back because it's like, well, all government's the same. They get used to the cash flow. It's very hard to pull it back. So I would suggest, you know, and hopefully we will over the next several years go forward with a discussion and a conclusion that we're going to set the permanent fund up in isolation regardless of our needs and desires. Then that we overlay that with a transition from where we are at that given time to where we need to be with the permanent fund. In other words, we may not, and this is getting kind of one step further, we may not want to say, starting in 2020, we're going to have a 4.5% payout, just bang. We might want to start, I think in the building now we're talking 5.25. We might want to start out with a higher one and ratchet ourselves back over several years by 25 or, you know, 0.25 percentage point or some number back, so we can get to the position where we want the permanent fund to be run without undue influence. But we work in the real world, and we have real bills to pay, so we have to have some flexibility. So don't get the impression I am advocating that one day we come in with a number and shut the door on the permanent fund and lock it up, and we can't, put everybody in a pickle. We can work these things through. So, Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate, after waiting 30 years, to come before your committee to talk about percent of market value. That's how long I've been working on percent of market value.
Wow.
Nothing new to me. My staff just laughs. They don't have to prepare the boss for anything. Just stick him in front of the group, and it's very simple. I will make a couple notes for and then I'll be quiet and then open it up for take some questions. We had sent this piece of legislation back several times to the drafters. They overcomplicate it with good intentions. And for the public to, I think, become comfortable with the restructuring of the permanent fund, it needs to be very clear, very transparent, no bells and whistles of if this arm wiggles, money comes out of this hand. Just straightforward. And we're going to, under this plan, we would close the door for any draws over 4.5%, and the permanent fund would manage the fund. It would be inflation-proof. We wouldn't have any inflation discussions on the floor of the legislature because it's automatically done. And we would get a check, the revenue would get a check coming in. We'd have the discussion on what do we want to do with our share, the state's share, the 2.5%. The other 2% goes out as dividends, and then we manage the state affairs or the financial affairs of the state with what we have. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be quiet and just answer questions the best I can. And I really appreciate the time.
Okay, thank you, Senator Stedman. Sorry you had to wait 30 years for this presentation. So, are there any questions from committee members? By the way, I'm keeping the committee overtime here. I hope that's not causing folks any hardship. Just a couple questions I have is, well, two. Some believe, I think, that our forefathers and mothers, I guess, who put the permanent fund together and the dividend. Do you think they intended the dividend to go into the Constitution as you're recommending? And if so, why didn't they do it back then?
I firmly believe that the earnings reserve needs to be rolled into the principal, and the entire permanent fund needs to be constitutionally protected. I think having the 2% dividend portion, or the split, in this case, we're talking about a 4% draw. Mm-hmm. So the split of the draw is open for public discussion. I think the Judiciary Committee's been working on that. My expectation is it would be less than 50-50 probability that would prevail in the final version of this piece of legislation. It is much more critical that the 4.5, the draw, is protected than the dividend.
Okay, fair enough. And then Senator Stedman, can you tell me again how you said it's automatically inflation-proofed. So in the, that slide right there, is that part of that 2.5% for general fund? Some of that is going towards inflation. How does it work?
No, the inflation proofing is derived as a component off of your rate of return. For instance, if you had a 2% inflation in this scenario, you would have to make over at least 6.5% or more a year. And that would, so if you made 6.5% and you took out 2% inflation, That leaves you the 4.5. So if you run your draw up too high relative to the performance of your portfolio, you will erode your purchasing power. That's why it is so critical that the draw rate is less than the targeted after inflation rate of return. If you make them the same, you have no room for error, and the probability is not good that you'll step on your foot most likely.
Okay.
So you draw that down, you move that draw number down to give you some real rate of return after inflation, after your withdrawal, so it's growing beyond the rate of inflation every year.
Okay, thank you, Senator Stedman. So in the example you just gave, a 4.5% draw, and if there's a 2% inflation, so you need 6.5% return at least. So what if you don't get that? What's impacted? The dividend or the general fund or?
No, that's a really good question, and I should have covered that. When you have really robust markets, we're going to pay out 4.5% a year on a 5-year average, regardless of what the market does. Market could go up, market could go down, market could stay flat. Doesn't matter. 4.5% every year. There will be times, in fact, there'll be more up markets and down markets on average. That's why economies get larger and larger, or the economies get larger and larger on average. That's why the markets get bigger. So there will be more years when you make extra. You'll make your 4.5% draw. You'll make your, say, 2% inflation, whatever inflation is at the time, 2.5, whatever. And like you might make 12% in a year or 15% in a year. And all that's great because you're jumping up in your return. There will be years like when we go back and look at recessions in 08, 09, 2000, go back to 1978, Black Monday. You can go back about every decade and you'll have a dip. In those dip years, you'll still get a draw of 4.5% over the 5-year average, but the 5-year average is going to be coming down because your market value is going down. Some would argue, well, then from the previous year you spent part of the principal. Well, say you only made 1% in a given year, and you take out 4.5 as an example. Some would argue, well, then you spent some of the principal, but that's true in certain regards. But that's why you want this structure, so when we have down years, you have a smooth cash flow coming out, because your up years are going to more than offset that. To turn it upside down, you just bring your payout rate to 6 or 7 or 8%, and then the down markets push your value down, your purchasing power down. You can't afford down markets. That's why it's more comfortable to have a draw rate with some cushion in it. That's why it's not at 5 1/4, or not at 5, or not at 4 3/4. But that's through the public, also the discussion and the evolution in the legislature. The legislature may decide that 4.5 is too conservative. They want 4 3/4, or 4.8, or 5, or 5 1/4. I think the permanent fund will have some discussions or some input on some of that. What rates they're comfortable with. But there will be times when you have a down market, and it could last for 2-3 years.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Stedman. Committee questions, Senator Giesel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Senator Stedman, tell me about what you're calculating for the population during these 4 years you've portrayed.
1% growth, I think.
Growth.
I think what we did on these, we took the amount of dividends that they paid, the number, and just divided it into the dollars. I don't have the equation here in front of me, but that's how we derived the $1,800. So I think it was 650,000? 615,000 actual dividend checks are paying out. Trying to get it as close as we could. And then population historically has been growing at 1. I think lately it's been shrinking, so if the population shrinks, there's, you know, in this case, the 1.116 billion, you know, would be divided amongst fewer people.
Okay, Senator Giesel.
Senator Stedman, I think that well, first of all, I don't question at all the mathematical accuracy of what your calculations show or the mathematical logic of it at all. But as someone who deals in the realm of people, if we had a dividend that was growing like this, I believe our population would grow, and I believe that our Medicaid costs would mushroom, to say nothing of Office of Children's Services issues and our substance abuse issues. Again, I'm not thinking about this in a mathematical way. I'm thinking about the impact that this kind of a dividend of over $2,000 will have on people. So this is pretty serious as I look at it, in a negative way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator
May I
Giesel.
respond, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please do, Senator Stedman.
The draw rate was driven off of the asset allocation, their investments, and then performance, and that's what set that. The dollar amounts are driven off of the happenstance of the size of the fund, 65 billion or 60-some billion dollars. And the 5-year average just happened to be what the average was. If and through the process that the legislature felt that 2% for a dividend is too big, you could take it down to 1.5 and add 3 over on the other side, add that 0.5% to the general fund. You can move those numbers around to whatever the legislature feels comfortable. But to get at the end of the day, we need, I firmly believe, the public support for a constitutional amendment to restrict, to collapse the earnings reserve into the corpus and block the legislature's ability to do ad hoc withdrawals, or we're going to spend the money.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Giesel. Thanks, Senator Stedman. Senator Cowgill.
Senator Stedman, I so agree with you on the management structure of collapsing the earnings reserve into what this is an endowment approach that really locks this into, it takes it out of the volatility area and settles it down. I really appreciate that. I do honestly struggle with putting a constitutional amendment in for the right of a dividend. I just struggle with that. So, and I've made that pretty clear all along the way. So, in looking at this, I would much rather have a approach that you have here. I think this is an excellent approach of managing the wealth. Then I would much rather have this wealth then go and describe a dividend in statute that could be revisited. And I'll tell you why I think that. First of all, I don't want to put it alongside any other right in our Constitution. That's number one. Secondly, we struggle with how to determine residency in Alaska, our military coming and going, people who are moving all the time, and yet say, by way of swearing that they're going to come move back. I think we'd have to have a real look at how we deal with that if we're going to put it in as a constitutional right. And I just don't know how I would do that right now. So statutorily, I think we probably have a better way of managing that than constitutionally. I just struggle with it. I don't know the answer to it. I think this is a marvelous piece of work outside of that. And so I listened as intently as I can, but that's a principle that I struggle with that you and I have just not been able to work through at this point, mainly because once you make it a constitutional right, then the citizenry of Alaska will have a hard time being unique in its description, but it'll be unique in its right. And so I think the question that was brought up by Senator Giesel then becomes even a bigger question yet, because people would move in just for a right. So I struggle with that. And I think that as I look at this, I'm going to try and figure out how I can find a way to get to where you want to go, because I think this is the best management structure I've seen to date.
Okay, Senator Stedman.
Suggestion?
Yes, please.
I think it's a subject matter that should be discussed in judiciary. I would not be surprised or opposed to the constitutional protection of the dividend portion removed, or the dividend portion adjusted with some flexible formula, something like that. I think that needs to get worked out in the process. Again, the key point here is to protect the entire permanent fund with the constitutional protection from us mainly, with all our good, good intentions, and that we come up with a comfortable draw, a safe draw. I like 4.5. I know it's probably on the lower side for a lot of people, but there's, a political process we go through, and whatever that draw is, it is. I don't think the legislature is going to put a draw rate that's going to be excessively high, too excessively high, because I think the permanent fund would object, because they would see erosion of value. So I think those concerns that both Senator Giesel and yourself bring forward are just part of the process that we go through when each committee works on a bill and changes it. But we just want to keep looking over our shoulders at the end of the day, because we want the public to support what we do. And I recognize the concern of a growing dividend and the value. I remember when this portfolio was $8 billion, I thought it was big. Now it's 60, and then you go forward a few years just on this slide, it's 72. There's a chance in the 2023 will be, and it's as easy to turn $100 billion into $200 billion as it is 10,000 to 20. The magic of compounding. So I think it would be a legitimate discussion on how to control size of the dividend, because we may end up with a portfolio nest egg for our children, which would be ideal, that is phenomenally big, and run the state off it.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the comments. There's two things I like about this especially. The comment that he said that this should be preserved for generations in Alaska, and then the structure is a tried and true methodology. And I think we should move this along to judiciary. And because of the kerfluffle that I've had in judiciary over the last few days, I would commit to the senator that I would bring it up for discussion, because he may question that. Because I think this is probably as good a methodology as I've seen to date. In all the years that we've been discussing this, this is the cleanest way of doing that I've seen. And I think it should be I think we should bring it up for discussion. We're at the 11th hour, but it's still an important part of the conversation.
I think those that, if I could, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Those that think the proposal is, the proposal in concrete and thou shalt not change it, it's perfect, are going to be surprised. I am adamant of constitutional protection of the corpus, and preferably the earnings reserve, and closing that door. The dividend structure, the payout structure, that's all just the process of the discussion. And I think there is problems, downside to constitutionally putting in the dividend in. There's no doubt about that. And the growth of a very large dividend does attract some social issues, because we all see the HES budget. And frankly, and that's scary.
Okay, so let's go to public testimony, and I don't see anyone. Am I not seeing things correctly? Okay, now let's go ahead and close public testimony. Okay, is there any committee discussion? I think I heard the judiciary chair saying he wanted this, so I'm happy to let him have it. You got quite a bit of work already, though, Mr. Chair. Does Senator Coghill comment?
Mr. Chairman, based on the events in my committee of the last week, there are people very, very interested in this, but they're interested quite often for reasons that are not similar to what this senator brought this bill forward for. And I think what we need to do, and I think it's our responsibility, I totally agree with the focus. It's our job to bring as much stability to this as we possibly can. And we have created a treasure that just needs to come to the time of life that it is so it can go on to the next generation. And just by the virtue of the draws that we are now looking over our shoulder or looking over the banister to draw in our earnings reserve and create a real cash flow problem, it's important that we have this discussion, I think. So I think, and we've looked at probably 4 different methods of doing this. This is probably the cleanest that I've seen of all that we've ever proposed, including your original proposal. So, yes, I think we should move it on and take a look at it.
You're not going to make the good senator to wait 30 years, are you? Is there any other questions from the committee members? Okay, well, there's no cost to the state to do this, apparently. So 0 fiscal notes.
Really?
That's what it says.
Constitutional amendment?
It's putting them on the.
On regular ballot.
on the ballot.
Oh, okay. Doesn't have a finance referral?
Yes,
Yes,
it
it
does.
does. It does have fun. Yes, yes. Okay, so if there's no other comments, then Senator Giesel.
Mr. Chairman, I move Senate Joint Resolution Number 4, Version 30, LS1085/Omega from this committee to the next, with attached fiscal notes and individual recommendations.
Okay, if there's no objections, then the bill will move from committee. So thank you, Senator Stedman. So with that, the committee will be adjourned. Please stay around for the book to sign, the recommendations. We do have a meeting scheduled for Tuesday. We're under the 24-hour rule, so we could expedite that, but I don't see anything on the agenda that needs to come up prior to next Tuesday, so we'll just go ahead for now. Keep our Tuesday meeting at the same time, and if something changes, we'll certainly let you know. So with that, if there's nothing else come up.
At least I got all wine off my back.
Yeah, yeah. If there's nothing else coming for the committee, thank you so much for staying over, and we're adjourned.